Roughly 10,000 people have congregated here in Gary this weekend of weekends.
I am a black man. I want a black party. I do not trust white Republicans or white Democrats.
It was an exciting time in politics for black people.
Black political power is building up. That's one of the great successes of the civil rights and voting rights movement in the country. They are electing mayors of big cities and small towns.
We have been denied progress and had our progress suppressed so long, you want it. You want to see change faster. Ambassador Young is a national treasure. I started reading about him when I was 13 years old, so I studied his life. I decided I was going to be mayor of Atlanta when I was 13. I would not have been elected mayor without him.
You had the rise of Shirley Chisholm, who was also a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus.
Elected to Congress, becomes the first black woman nominated.
Walter Fauntroy was one of the most out front people. Marion Barry was an activist at this time. People have to understand, it's the largest class of Congressional Black Caucus, black congressional members ever. It keeps growing. President Barack Obama was a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. The Congressional Black Caucus has most often been referred to as the conscience of the Congress, and the legislation that has come from them individually and collectively has been integral, has been life-changing in Congress, and the legislation they've stopped has also been incredibly important to what's happening in this country now. And to no surprise, President Nixon refused to meet with them.
He called his approach benign neglect when it came to civil rights issues. The government would enforce the laws that were on the books, but they weren't going to expand anything. They weren't going to take new initiatives. When it came to renewal of the 1965 Voting Rights Act in 1970, and for technical reasons, you had to renew this act in 5 years. Richard Nixon was president, Congress renewed it, and Nixon supported it. He signed it into law.
How does this president feel about my community? They might say the right things publicly, but what are behind closed doors? What are they saying about black people?
And last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television as I did,
yeah,
to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
Well, and then the tail wags the dog there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The tail wags the dog.
There's always going to be public facing with these candidates, but particularly as it relates to black people, we know that there's just this extra consideration that you have in the back of your mind.
Brown decision in 1954. But even by the 70s, there were still school districts in America that were refusing to desegregate. So the short part story of the Wilmington 10 is that I, at the age of 23, and 8 young black high school student leaders, one white woman who was 28 years old, fighting to give black kids an equal opportunity and to make sure that the court-ordered desegregation order would be done fairly to the black community. The 10 of us were accused of starting the riot in Wilmington. We were the victims of white supremacist attacks. So the violence was directed at us, but yet, keep in mind, Nixon is still president. Agnew is still vice president. And Nixon became president in the wake of Dr. King's assassination, running on what? Law and order. Law and order. Did not mean equal rights for black people. Law and order meant we're going to use the criminal justice system to repress the movement. We're going to use the judicial system to make sure we're going to punish y'all for march. We're going to punish y'all for demonstrating. And that's what happened to the Wilmington 10. The 10 of us were sentenced to 282 years in prison. Of the 10, I had the longest prison sentence, 34 years. So it took us almost a decade to prove our innocence. Because for many black people in America, you're guilty till you prove your innocence. And such was the case with the Wilmington 10. We became political prisoners. What I want to point out, One of the young kids that we were fighting for to make sure they get equal chance at school was named Michael Jordan. Turned out to be a pretty good basketball player.
A black American openly displaying his Republican politics is very much a rarity. But James Jones is one of possibly 15% of black Americans voting for Mr. Nixon, and he doesn't mind what the customers think. What do they say to you?
Oh, many of them, most of them say, how dare you be for Nixon? How dare you support this Nixon administration? But it doesn't matter to me.
Judy Howell is active in the Afro-American movement.
Nixon's move on the White House was very well organized, and as the Watergate incident indicates, that the people, whoever will support him and back him, are ready to go to any ends, even illegal ones, and sabotage to ensure he's staying in.
Blacks in America expect Mr. Nixon to get back into the White House for 4 more years, and they don't expect him to do very much for them. There's a general feeling that they're neglected, and no one here would be surprised if a great many of them don't bother to vote at all.
And he ends the Vietnam War-ish right ahead of election time to make sure that those ballots go his way.
We today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
And he knows full well that that's not possible, so he just drags the thing out while bringing some troops home, but leaving enough troops there to keep dragging the thing out until it's after the election so that you don't look like you're losing before people have to cast a ballot for you.
Nixon won in '72. It was a landslide. Black folks didn't matter. The backlash from 1968 was still there, and Nixon defeated McGovern. And of course, by 1974, Nixon was no longer in power. He had resigned.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
You know, Richard Nixon's vice president had been Spiro Agnew, the former governor of Maryland. Before Nixon resigned, Spiro Agnew had come up on criminal charges for some behavior during his governorship of Maryland, and Agnew had resigned, and the constitutional approach was to have the president appoint a new vice president and have it approved by the Congress, and he appointed Gerald Ford. So Gerald Ford was our only unelected vice president. He hadn't been elected vice president, and then he would become president, and he hadn't been elected president either. Ford was going to run, but he wasn't going to be unchallenged. Ronald Reagan, as governor, representing an even more conservative wing of the party, he was going to challenge Ford.
Do you think you'll be the Republican nominee in '76?
I don't know. I'm going to try.
So by 1976, Ronald Reagan had really become the heir of Barry Goldwater and the poster boy for conservative republicanism in this country. He was the one who started calling African American women who were on welfare
as a welfare queen.
A welfare queen.
Welfare queen actually comes from a 1974 expose done by the Chicago Tribune. Presidential hopeful Ronald Reagan used the information from that 1974 expose and began to attack the welfare system using Linda Taylor.
In Chicago, they found a woman who holds the record. She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year.
In his speech, he over-exaggerated the extent of how much she defrauded. He claimed that she was making $150,000 a year in welfare schemes, when in actuality she had only schemed about $8,000 from the system. And as attention-grabbing as that label is, it barely scratches the surface of who she really was. Linda was not merely this caricature depicted in media reports. She was a woman of many identities, each one more elusive than the last. And her life was a maze of deception, and there was an array of crimes that extended far beyond the welfare.
Welfare is not a black issue. Welfare is a poverty issue. There are more white folks on welfare than black people.
If you travel outside of America and you go to these countries with free healthcare, free childcare, that when you get pregnant, they send you an entire box of resources, right? Places where elder care is the norm. These social safety nets exist and no one questions it. No one says, I'm giving my have money to the have-nots. No one says this is unfair. People understand that that's a part of being a part of a society, of a community, that there are some things that we all put in for to make sure that when people need those safety nets, they have access to them. But in America, because people want to maintain their power, the idea that I would give you anything out of my pocket to help you do for you and your family, there's a lot of people that don't like that.
The Republicans still had members who believed that there should be a social safety net for people who were poor. Not so much Reagan here.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
He decided he would run for the presidency. Interestingly enough, African Americans were the first to line up behind Jimmy Carter. A number of things occurred that were beyond Jimmy Carter's control, but it worked against him. The rising prices of oil in the 1970s really hurt Jimmy Carter.
I want to have a frank talk with you tonight about our most serious domestic problem. That problem is inflation.
Would you vote for him again?
No, under the circumstances, I'm afraid I'd have to withhold my vote.
I thought that his defeat by Ronald Reagan was a devastating moment for the country.